and thank you everyone for coming. I think at the very beginning I should apologize that my presentation won't be as refined as the previous presentations. It's because it's still very much a research in progress. It's my current project in Media and Communications Department at London School of Economics, when I have interviews with Polish LGBTQs in the UK, mostly about their social media uses, and I think specifically about the idea of identity and intersections of different aspects of identities. So I only have a limited number of pilot interviews so far, so I treat this kind of presentation as a kind of brainstorming, so you're very welcome to ask me at the end not only questions, but also share your kind of ideas or comments. It's very welcome. As I said, it's a very much work in progress. But this is some kind of first ideas coming from my pilot interviews. So at the very beginning, I'll give you a brief kind of background for my research, how I kind of position it. Then I'll give you some theory, and then I'll give you at the end some kind of initial research or some excerpts from my first interviews to see how they maybe all connect, the background theory and the research. So let's start with the background. So first, the starting point and kind of background for this project is to think about gender, sexuality, and nationalism, and specifically about Polish LGBTQs who moved to the UK after 2004. And I think that Polish LGBTQs in the UK are a little bit in this kind of liminal place between Poland and UK. And on the one hand, we have this kind of heterosexist nationalism of Poland, when the hegemonic version of national identity is very much exclude any kind of queers. And on the other hand, we have the rise in homonationalism discourses in United Kingdom. When by homonationalism I mean the embracement of some LGBTQs within dominant idea about the national identity, but to do it instrumentally. So, for example, kind of imagining, it's mostly attributed to the Western countries which imagine themselves as kind of very tolerant, or almost like essentially and historically LGBTQ tolerant. And they use it, as I said, instrumentally, not just to embrace those people, but they embrace only some of those people, and they embrace them also instrumentally to show that other people are not tolerant, not LGBTQ friendly. Especially, it's referred to Muslims and Arabs, but I think recently, especially with the rise of the Brexit discourses, it's also Eastern Europe in general is kind of created in this kind of, homophobic, sexist, and racist place, while the West is imagined as post-racist, post-feminist, and post-racist, feminist, and post-gay. Yes, all of them. So now I'll give you some examples for that. This is not very it's not very representational. It's very extreme picture coming from the neo-Nazi website, where we can see like a group of, actually only men, I think, only men holding Polish flags and saying, "You call us fascists? We are not fascists." And you call those people Polish people? They're kind of suggesting that like they shouldn't be considered as true Poles. So who are those people? Of course, those associated with Soviet Union, European Union, and all kind of transgender and LGBTQ people in general. So this is an extreme example, but I think, especially now with the rise of the PiS, of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, we can also see it crawling, and at least in this, again, hegemonic version of national identity. I don't want to say that it's in general like that in Poland, but just this hegemonic, dominant version of national identity. And here we can also refer to, for example, this special parliamentary group that was created in Poland, Stop Ideology of Gender, which is part, and some of you may know, this broader campaigns against so-called gender ideology, which interestingly is not only characteristic of Eastern European countries, but also Western European countries. So I think it's very important to mention that, also not to reproduce this idea as, again, homophobic East and gay tolerant West. And now moving to the second part, so thinking about this homonationality, so that was Poland. And now this kind of more homonationalistic discourses in the UK. This is a quote by Boris Johnson during the Brexit referendum, who said, it was us, the British people, that created the environment of happiness and contentment for LGBTQ or LGBT people, and it's absolutely vital we fight for those rights today, because they are under threat in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, and other parts of the EU, where they are not protected in the way they are in our country. So we can very clearly see this kind of discourse of our country, Britain, as being LGBT tolerant, but I think it's also very interesting to mention that specifically in the context of the Brexit referendum, because I don't know how Brexit would kind of solve those problems. How would that Brexit help those oppressed people, LGBT people in Poland, Hungary, and Romania, or how to protect Britain from that? So I think that's kind of interesting, specific use in that context. So this is kind of background information. So in a way, as a lot of Polish LGBTQs in the UK, I think you can consider it, as I said before, in this liminal space between not being very welcome in Poland because of homophobia or LGBTQ phobia or any kind of queerness, and on the other hand, not being welcome very much here because of Eastern Europeans. And Eastern Europeans, especially in the Brexit referendum, often are considered as conservative, as I said, sexist. This kind of idea of a queer Polish migrant is almost as an impossible subject, as kind of not making this connection. So yeah, about those discussions about this kind of myths, what I call imagined geographies, have different ideas about gender sexuality issues related to gender sexuality are imposed on very specific geographies of like Central Eastern Europe or Middle East and so on. I discussed it a little bit in my book, which is Transnational Homosexuality in Communist Poland, Cross-Border Flows in Gay and Lesbian Magazines, which I also try to challenge those myths, but I will not go now into that. So now, let me move to the kind of more theoretical part, which is, you think it's not very much connected to the background that I just told you about, but it will make sense at the end, so please bear with me. So I mentioned at the very beginning that I'm media scholar, so I'm specifically thinking about the digital media and the importance of digital media. And in my new project, I'm specifically interested in profiles, of profile making in general. So profile making has become ubiquitous in digital culture, so I'm thinking about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all kinds of social media, but also dating sites. We also create profiles for online banking or for online games. So in general, this kind of idea of the call to constantly represent yourself within the confines of the profiles. And profiles are the key part of social networking services. It's almost like when you look at the definition of what is social networking service, it's usually said as you create a profile, you connect to your friends, and then interact through profiles. That's why I think I'm focusing a lot on social networking services. And for me, profiles are also about the self. I think this is how we write ourselves into digital being. This is how I connect profiles to identity. And profiles specifically, I would like to think about them as cover date, as a series of performative acts which constitute the self. So here, cover refer to, of course, Judith Butler and her idea of identity as performance, the idea that our identities is a part of kind of repetitions of very specific performances, which identity categories being stabilized also through this kind of repetitive of performances, but also on the other hand, because it's repetitive performances, because of that, it's also possible to perform it differently in every time. So because of that, there's this subversive potential there as well. Even though in general, those repetitions, if it's the same way, it's kind of stabilized some notions about, I don't know, masculinity and femininity, for example. So how I think about it, so maybe now another note that I should make. So I like to think about these profiles and identities specifically and talk to that literature, but from the perspective of queer migrants, specifically Polish LGBTQs in the UK. And this is also my kind of small political academic project, because I think doing area studies, doing kind of Polish or Central and Eastern European studies, very often we are relegated to this idea of the particular. You know, there is this kind of universal queer theory, some universal feminist theories, Of course, it was challenged as well, but this is, I think, still quite a strong idea. And then there's this area studies, which is very particular. And it's a kind of raw material in need of theory, or needs theory to be explained. And I want to challenge that. That's why my idea in that project is as well to kind of take this very specific and unique kind of perspective. Because when you look at the research into profiles and identities, there are a lot of research on that. But very often there's a kind of general sample, you know? And quite rarely, or most often actually, it's US students, this kind of general sample. So I think when you look into, like, take the example of kind of queer migrants and this specific group, but not to say how specific they are, there are some specificities, but also kind of to change what we can learn about what's the relations about profiles and identities, or mediation of identity in the digital age, or digital media age. So here I want to think about intersectionality. For me it was quite obvious to land here because I have these different aspects like sexuality, gender, and migration, some kind of national identity, ethnicity are kind of there. So I think it was quite not that surprising that I ended up with the theories of intersectionality, which were originally introduced by women of color, and here especially Crenshaw. Here the idea is very briefly, probably most of you are familiar with those theories, but the general idea is Crenshaw was actually not writing about identity, but all about discrimination, and she said it's not only that it's adaptive, it's not only that you are woman and lesbian and black, and then you add those different discrimination, but the very specific intersection creates a very specific kind of discriminations. One of her examples was that in one factory, they were not discriminating against women. Women were employed. Were not discriminating against black people. Black men were employed, but actually black women were not employed. So that's specific. If you're just thinking about the gender aspect or just race aspect, it doesn't explain why this group is discriminated against. And then she also gave this example of metaphor of intersection. So she said that discrimination very often is just the results of different parts of identities, for example, intersecting. So a very specific case of discrimination could be a kind of an event of an accident, which could be just by one car, but could be also 2 cars or 3 cars coming together, 4 cars. So it depends on very specific situations. This model, however, was also criticized as a kind of gridlock model. Then you think about different identity categories as a kind of stable category identities. There's this blackness, there's a womanhood, and so this is the intersection. And it was criticized that because of that, this is kind of locked, and now we only think about it through that. And there was also a criticism that there was overemphasis on, because it came from the women of color critic, there was focusing only on 2 categories of race and gender, though some other works later on were also adding different aspects of identity. But here I was specifically inspired by the Just Birpoir work on assemblage, which kind of builds on intersectionality. She's not, she's criticizing intersectionality, but also builds on that. She says there is some aspect of intersectionality that I agree with, and she specifically points to that metaphor of the accident, because she thinks about this kind of categories of race, gender, sexuality, as that should be considered as encounters between bodies rather than simply attributes of subjects. So here, there's different part of discrimination, or actually Poir is already writing about identity, so using this kind of discussion about discrimination to talk about identity as a kind of within this model. So not it's gridlock, but it's more like it's an accident. So at one point, it could be that this race and gender intersects, but the other part, maybe there's a different aspect and more important. So it's not fixed, but it's more about this as a kind of process, as a kind of being assembled from very different aspects in a very specific situation, but it could be disassembled and assembled in a different way in different situations. So, giving that introduction, theoretical introduction, I was thinking about how those kind of assemblages is happening, how this kind of assembling and disassembling is happening specifically on, as it's mediated, so in the different social media. And here I would specifically, what is next? Yes, specifically I was focused on Facebook. My research is about many different, as I said, different profiles. I'm taking the kind of media decentered approach, which is not focusing on a very specific medium or platform, but rather start with people asking about different profiles, navigating different profiles, presenting themselves at the same time or different time differently in different profiles. But here very quickly to talk about those assembling and disassembling, I would like to focus on Facebook, which is also very specific mediated context, which is kind of semi-private, semi-public, but also non-anonymous. Like early research on digital media was saying, you know, you could be whoever you want on the internet, you can be anonymous, you can pretend you are a dog, as a very popular cartoon in New York Times was saying. But now in Facebook, it's a different kind of medium, that you actually, this anonymity is not really there. And I think what is also crucial for my research, the idea of context collapse. So here is, it comes from the idea of Goffman that, you know, we present ourselves differently in different situations to different groups. And then on Facebook, those different contexts collapse because we now have one presentation. We kind of are expected to have just one kind of presentations for different groups. It could be, in case of Polish LGBTQs in the UK, your family back in Poland. It could be your colleagues in the UK. It could be your gay friends in London, and different groups together for which you have to create this one kind of unified version of presentation of yourself. There are different methods to kind of challenge that, also within Facebook, but in general, the default is that all the contexts collapse, and then you have to present this kind of unified version. So here I would like to now give you this, some quotes from one of my interviewees. She's Alex, she's self-identified lesbian from Brighton. She moved to Brighton about 10 years ago, and there are some quotes. I was a Facebook friend with my manager from Sainsbury's, and he started reposting a lot of posts from Britain First, so I friended him. So Britain First is this very nationalistic British organization. Another quote, when I posted a selfie where I kissed my girlfriend, a friend of my back from college commented, "Oh my God, I didn't know that you're a lesbian," and added thousands of exclamation marks. And then she explained that after that she didn't have to react because all of her friends who knew that she's a lesbian posted like, "Oh my God, we didn't know about it." So they floated it and make it very ironic, like thousands of messages like, "Oh my God, are you a lesbian, really?" And she really likes it. She said like, okay, I was not in the position that I have to now defend myself or explain myself. Actually all my Facebook friends reacted to that. And another example, once I started to argue with a friend of mine on Facebook. She wrote something about Brexit, that it would be good for us, that NHS, National Health System, or service, and jobs will be finally only for English people. I was very surprised and irritated by this. And then she started to talk to her about it, and her friend was kind of a little bit apologetic, but the friend of the friend were attacking her, saying, so it was also much more complicated here. But what's interesting for me, for this presentation, I mentioned the title, this kind of accidental, coincidental homophobia, or xenophobia. So I think this Facebook as a very specific digital media environment with this kind of context collapse created this kind of accidental statements that with her manager in Sainsbury's, she never really talked about Brexit or Britain First. She thought they are a good colleague, and then she just by accident showed that she is kind of keep reposting the stuff from Britain First. Here was the same, again, this kind of accidental thing, like from college, friend back from college, maybe she even forgot who that person was. It's now kind of talking about, oh, you're lesbian, I'm so surprised. And another one, the last one, I think is also very, the same way. It was actually a very good friend of hers, so she was very surprised because she said, like, again, we didn't talk about Brexit, we didn't talk about this kind of ideas, we were just very good friends. So I was so surprised that she actually showed this kind of opinions on Facebook. So this is how I kind of I want to go back to this kind of thinking about assembling and disassembling, and I think that's my initial ideas for now, that we have to take into account this kind of different levels of context. One is technological context, so Facebook affordances, so what Facebook or different medium afford you to do, as I said about the context collapse, but also kind of post or not, for example. Another is the situational context, so here more from Goffman, who was very focused on very specific situation. It actually does matter with a very specific pose, very specific comment, like. But I think what is always, or not always, but quite often forgotten in those research, which is very much US-centric, it's this kind of broader social, cultural, and political context, which also provokes this very specific assembling or disassembling, like Brexit or the growing homophobia. They also kind of, we could see that this kind of topics were appearing there because of this kind of larger cultural, political context, which also provoked some ideas, for example, national identity. And she also was talking to Alex, one of my interviewees, she was also talking about how she didn't feel very much associated with Poland and Polish identity, but now it was kind of reinvigorated in her. And she kind of feels like she has to defend her Polishness and showing, she said that she started posting in English, for example, some information about how Polish police gets training about how to treat women. So she was kind of showing this kind of good image of Polishness there. So this is these different aspects, and that's basically it, what I prepared. At the end, I just have a very short plug. That tonight, not tonight, but tomorrow, we have this Polaktastic night that we co-organized with Nick and Wojtek, who is sitting there. And I will organize like do-it-yourself zine station there, stories of migrant queer bodies, when I'm presenting story of Alex, but also other stories that you can just read in a little bit longer stories, and then you can add your other stories or other participants and create yours in this way. So that's from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really like super interesting panel. Many thanks. So I have a question to Nicholas Boston, and I mean I really loved your paper, and I was thinking about doing like similar research, but about the images of Arab men in Poland, and then in a little bit in the context of this in mind, I would like to ask you about. You showed all the roots of this thinking in Malinowski, but how about like a Cold War situation when there is a lot of exchange about within the Second War between Poland and various countries from which either black or Arab people would come, and then they are very much like a perfect material for a husband, for instance, because they are rich, they are handsome, they don't drink as much as Polish men. So there's some kind of positive image back then. But also there's also a threat that is like other culture and this marriage will not work. So I was thinking, do you see any like Cold War roots for what you were talking about? And I also have a tiny little question about Imieliński. Because in my own interviews with senior gays and lesbians, I heard several times that there's this green book by Imieliński, and this green book was really like important because there was something about the Kinsey report, and there's really a lot about homosexuality. So you didn't read it like that. Just only the pathological aspect.
Thank you. Well, we'll gather a few, three, four questions, and then we'll.
So, okay, you were saying that your interviewee was sort of feeling the need to defend her Polishness. I didn't get whether that was because Peace was sort of constructing Polishness in a way that she didn't agree with, or because the British were just rejecting all Poles en masse as a result of Brexit, or whether it was a mixture of the two.
Thank you. level of government, on the moment, you need to be rather tolerant because this issue was mastered by Orthodox Church, so politics were invited. So it's of course this is not probably the.
I have to stop you here because we have very little time. Thank you for the comment that Lukasz will definitely refer to. Any question? Okay, shall we start the first round of the questions and let's start from this side.
Thanks for your question. The short answer to that is yes.
But a long, I want a long answer.
I'm going to give you the long-ish answer because I'm going to get spanked if I go too long.
No.
But, which would be fun. But so in this sort of like Cold War context, I mean, I have 3 examples that I can give to you. You're absolutely right. So you have all of these African countries and countries globally, but we're speaking specifically, or my knowledge specifically is about the movement of blackness or black bodies through Poland and how those passages take place. And so yes, there are all these African countries that are experimenting, if you will, with communism and socialism. And so you do have this influx of students. That person that you described, is highly educated or will be highly educated, people who train to be lawyers and engineers and so on. And
Doctors.
And doctors. And many of those, I was thinking, doctors, lawyers. Many of those people remain in the country, right? And so, the first, as you all know, the first black MP, member of parliament, who was elected, I believe his name is Godson. So, he's that figure, and he's married, he has 4 or 5 children. The interesting thing, the sort of takeaway from that is that, he famously says, racism doesn't exist in Poland. He says, I'm integrated, fully integrated. I've never had any sort of like issues living in the country. I have a beautiful wife and I have 5 beautiful children, and da-da-da. This is his discourse. This is not my sort of like saying anything. So there's that. Ethnographically, from my work, there's several of my informants who have very positive experiences with that figure that you described, the person who is, these. I'll give you one very brief example. This one of my informants, who actually lives in Poland, he was speculating on whether he wanted to move to the UK, and he had very, very positive sort of opinions about black men. And I said, so, well, why do you feel that way? And he said, well, I have these friends who are married to these guys, and they're like doctors, and they're responsible, and they're this and they're that. And so it's very interesting because it's, similar to this idea of flipping, right? Certainly those types of positive imaginings tend to be rare in, certainly in North America, and certainly here as well. And then my own experience, I think it was in Warsaw. Yeah, it was in Warsaw. I was going back to the airport. The taxi driver was an African man, and he was more than happy to tell me all of this stuff about his life in Warsaw. And he had arrived, possibly not as a student because he was driving a taxi, but he'd been there for 20, 30 years. His wife was Polish. His children were born Polish, and so on. So yes, that kind of geopolitical kind of formation did facilitate or enable these passages of these people, which then kind of connected to other kind of psychic formations as well.
Thank you.
So the first question about defending Polishness and what is it sparked by? In my interviews so far, which is not that many, 4 interviews, it was mostly by kind of Brexit discourses. It was mostly about kind of being attacked as Eastern European, maybe not always directly, but sometimes indirectly, seeing the discourse of that. Sometimes more indirectly, but also on Facebook, so not necessarily mainstream media. But that was main provocation to kind of now trying to, in my interviews, to kind of stand for Polishness and showing that Poland is not that bad. I can imagine that the other part can also spark that as well, especially in relation to kind of gender sexuality issues, maybe specifically to show that actually Poland is not that bad. It's also some aspect of tolerance. So it didn't appear so far in my research, but I can I give it as a kind of potentiality or possibility in my research. And for the imagined geographies, so first of all, I should say that I'm not a historian, as I said, not as I said, but now I'm saying I'm not a historian. And so I'm working with contemporary imaginations of how West specifically imagined the East, or Western Europe and Eastern Europe. But I can totally take you I won't have a problem with seeing that it was a different image of Central Eastern Europe and different image of West, like as you mentioned, 16th or 17th century. So I don't know really what was the image, but the part of that, of my point is that this is a construct, this image, it's imagined geography. So that can of course change in history and can change from different perspective, depending on who is speaking. So I think it's not really contradictory there. What I think is it could be different image, but I'm working with kind of contemporary imagination of Central Eastern Europe in the West in relation to gender and sexuality.
Thank you. Grzegorz? And if I can abuse a little bit my position here, I would like to ask you also the question, if you could, Grzegorz, answer this, because you gave us this wonderful talk about how theatre is this space between openness and denial of visibility of LGBT people, and but is there anything specific of 1970s, of 1980s, of communist Poland that gave a different aspect to this theatre as this space? Because theatre has always been a space of playing with the role, with the gender roles. So is there anything characteristic?
So, but firstly, I try to answer your question. That's why I remember this, and I'm not sure that I am right, and I haven't verified it, but I can check it because my aunt is still alive, and I think she has all books from the time, so I will do that.
Well, I haven't anyway.
Yeah, but
curious
as
about
far as
your
I remember, there was something, the sign of this deviation discourse in this book. Maybe you are right that there are some data, but I couldn't find any comforting in this book at the time. That's what I remember.
Yeah, that was my question.
For your question, yes, it is taken for granted that theatre is always very open space, and that there is over-representation of gay people in theatre. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon. And that's why theatre is accused of being homolobby or something like that. Jana Szczerkowska said that there is a strong homolobby in theatre. But I think that after 1968, when Polish theatre was very open in the West, and a lot of companies travel to France, to Great Britain, to Germany, and I have given the example of the pantomime theatre. A lot of gay men performed in this theatre, and they and theatre was a place of communication between Polish and Western countries at the time. And it's now my hypothesis. I want to but I think it is true that something changed after in the late 60s.
Thank you. We still have time for 2-3 questions. Okay, Rita, and here.
Hi, my name is Lukasz Szulc. my question is for Nicholas. I just sort of seek clarification. Because from what I understood, you're saying that the meeting of a sort of gay sort of reclaiming of male hero with blackness is sort of an easy marriage, because a black male body wears that kind of gay male worship very differently, and that's what Radziszewski is trying to do. Would you say that that meeting of gayness and blackness within the Polish context just sits very uneasily? Is that what?
I love that characterization. I love that description. Yeah, certainly the uneasiness. And, sorry. We were going to take.
You know, so
yeah.
Beata?
So I have a question to Lukasz. You mentioned that you are going to do interviews with LGBTQ people, and I would like to ask you what letters in the acronym will you be using, so which acronym you use in your research, and how these different identities would affect their experiences with this accidental homophobia or transphobia and so on.
Thank you. And last question.
Hi. My name is Dominic Jackson, called from UEL. My question is to both Lukasz and Nick, the kind of intersection of your work. Have you noticed through Brexit and Brexit discourses some kind of influence on the relationships between Polish, gay, queer Poles in the UK with the other? So, for example, black people of color.
Thank you. Nick?
Yes. So here's the interesting thing, and you just reminded me of a very crucial point that I didn't state. And this is something that's of much concern to the artist himself, which is that Ali was not gay, he wasn't queer. And in fact, in both print as well as conversations face to face that the artist has had with people, there is an assumption that Ali was homosexual. And so at one point in our conversation, he actually was saying, so this is a challenge of negotiating the archive. So as I said in my introduction, briefly, albeit, is his main focus, like his practice is around queering the archive in a number of different ways, and how does one do that is something that he's been playing with for a decade now. In terms of queering Ali, I find that there is a problematic way in which he approached that. He felt so his understanding of queering is very broad, right? It's not just around sexuality, but certainly this kind of uneasiness, tension, it can be productive. I mean, tension is what produces, it's generative, right? However, I feel that there is this sort of palimpsestic, there's this layering of these other discourses that unfortunately, just that one portrait, it's a series, there's several portraits that he made. But yes, you're right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do you also want to respond to the questions?
Oh yeah, you can think about it and you can
Okay,
think about
so we'll go and then we'll come again.
Okay. So maybe I'll start with this question. I think it's a great question. I still didn't figure it out much. I think the problem is that I also don't study really the discourses in general. I kind of study when I already filtered from my participants. So I really focus on LGBTQs, Polish LGBTQs in the UK. So then it's already kind of filtered for that. My one answer that I could give for it is, because you mentioned Polish queer, so this kind of combination. And I think this is not the first kind of thing that comes to very often to mind when you think. So what I was trying to say also before, that like Eastern European migrants, especially in this kind of Brexit referendum discourse, were often imagined as conservative, and that's why kind of this combination of queer Polish migrant, or that was kind of filled, as I said, kind of impossible subject. That's what we also call it. That's the kind of key point of our night tomorrow, this kind of podcast, kind of try to imagine this kind of combination of, yeah, there are some queers who are Polish and who are migrants as well. But I didn't think much about how this kind of relates to the kind of imagination of, I don't know, other kind of otherness, and how this relates to other otherness. But I think I'll definitely think about it because it's a very important question. And for the question about the LGBTQ letters, so I try very much I use actually LGBTQ, and I try to actively try to look for participants from the spectrum. So far, I have 4 interviews, pilot interviews. 2 of them are with self-identified gay men. 1 is a trans man, and 1 is a lesbian. But it's not always the easy. We know that there's like a problem with, I don't know, also with my self-identification, who is more likely to talk to me. But my idea is to actually have it as inclusive as possible. So I also try to go not only in London, but also two of my participants are from small cities in the north. So I try to make active effort to have this kind of proper diversity. And I'm sure that will also change the way how those people relate to those discourses. It's too early for me to say at this level at this stage of my research how it actually relates, but I'm sure there will be differences. That's why I want to have this diversity.
Thank you. And
thank you for the question. I think Brexit, and when I say Brexit, it's, as I think we're all talking on the same page, it's really the sort of rhetoric that's surrounding specifically this figure, right? And this figure being this kind of imagined Polish/Eastern European migrant, and what this figure represents, and what this figure can take, and what this figure is bringing. But I see this on a longer kind of historical continuum, right? So I've also done work around Polish migrants, not necessarily queer. I haven't, unfortunately, I haven't found any gay, lesbian, LGBTQ migrants from that period, but post-war Polish migrants to the United Kingdom. Primarily, I had an interest in the 66 Polish migrants that were on the Empire Windrush that arrived, and on Wednesday, I'm interviewing a gentleman who lives in Harlow, who is possibly the last surviving Windrush Polish passenger. He's 85 years old. Why am I telling you all of this? I find it ironic and sad, quite frankly. He lives in Harlow, in Essex, and in Harlow is where there was a murder just post-Brexit. A man was attacked by a group of, I think they were all underage, I'm not sure, but a gang of kids, simply because they heard him speaking Polish. One of the kids dealt him a blow, he fell on the street, he hit his head, he died. And this is where this gentleman, who was called the United Kingdom home for 60 years at this point, 70 years, he arrived here on the Windrush when he was 15, lives and has lived since he arrived. So I think all of that to say there is a historical continuum. I think that Brexit, yes, definitely has been addressed in other contexts today. We always have to be very specific about our periodization and about our kind of like historical touch points. I think it has definitely kind of galvanized and created a sense of affinities amongst Polish migrants. And many of those Polish migrants are now British citizens, right? We have to be very specific about what do we mean now when we talk about the post-2004 influx, because at what point do you cease to be a migrant? So, but
thank you. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Lukasz. Thank you, Grzegorz, for those amazing speeches and presentation. We don't have any time for more questions. I will have to take you for the coffee breaks. Please join me to thank you for the